Hi everyone, Shabbat Shalom. We are in Parshat Hukat this week in the book of Numbers, moving swiftly along through the Torah. And our Parsha opens with this very strange incident, this very strange description of the red heifer, the red cow, sometimes known as the brown cow, which is completely free of impurities, which is then burned up in this ceremony. Its ashes are sprinkled in water. And this is used to purify those who have come into contact with a dead body. It's a very elaborate description. It takes up a whole chapter. And then immediately afterwards, at the beginning of chapter 20, we're thrust back into the narrative. We're back with the children of Israel. And we read about Miriam's death. And we read, Vayavo v'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbar tzin b'chodesh harishon vayeshev ha'am Bakadesh v'tamat sham Miriam v'tikarev sham v'tikaver sham. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Tzin on the first moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. And so we have these two things which seem to be quite different, this technical information followed by this narrative. And Rashi asks, Rashi, the medieval French commentator, asks, why are these two things close together? Why do we have these two things juxtaposed, one sort of right next to the other? To teach us that just as the red heifer can bring atonement, can bring purification, so too the death of a righteous person can bring atonement. So Miriam HaNeviah, Miriam the prophetess, being one of these righteous figures in our tradition, her death brings atonement. And we know that this death will bring atonement, yes, but death also brings a complex mix of emotional experiences, fear, loss, sadness, anger. And we see in the rabbinic tradition that the death of Miriam brings suffering to the community. We see in the very next verse that the community was without water and they are angry with Moses and Aaron, and they're kvetching, once again complaining to Moses and Aaron at this loss of water. Miriam being connected with water, with the well that miraculously followed the people throughout the desert so that they would have this life-giving thing, this water that would help them to survive. So not only does the community lose water, it also loses this prophetic voice and brings about some suffering. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the 20th century scholar and thinker, asks in his writing what I think is one of the most Jewish questions I've ever heard. He asks, what obligation does suffering impose upon us? Right? A more Jewish question I can't find, right? Because not only are we suffering, now we also have obligations about our suffering. We can't just suffer, we have to have obligations. Yes. So his response is that the obligation that suffering imposes on us is to make meaning and purpose out of it. So what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is explore how Miriam, Moses, and Aaron each responded to their suffering. What meaning did they make out of it, and what can we take away from that? So we'll start with Miriam. Miriam, the Midrash tells us, the rabbis tell us, was a prophetess from the earliest time in her life. In the Babylonian Talmud tractate Megillah, we read, Miriam was a prophetess, as it is written explicitly in the book of Exodus, and Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand. So the Gemara is asking, why is Aaron only named? Why not Moses? And Rav Nachman said, for she prophesied when she was the sister of Aaron, right? She had prophesied from the time she was a child, before Moses was born. And she would say, my mother is destined to bear a son who will deliver the Jewish people to salvation. And at the time when Moses was born, the entire house was filled with light. And her father stood and kissed her on the head and said to her, my daughter, your prophecy has been fulfilled. But once Moses was cast into the river, her father arose and rapped her on the head, saying to her, my daughter, where is your prophecy now? As it looked as though Moses would soon meet his end. Right? So this is the prophecy that she makes, that her parents are going to have this this son, this child, her mother is going to give birth to this son who is going to save the Jewish people from their suffering and redeem them. And then he is born, and then he's cast into the river, and there's a real fear that he's going to be killed. And what happens? She goes and she follows. If we look back in the beginning of the book of Exodus, she goes and she follows the baby after Moses is put into this basket, after he's put into the river. She goes. She's not named explicitly there, but the rabbis understand it to be Miriam, and she is the one who follows this basket to make sure that she knows what happens, what end comes. And so she follows the basket, she follows her baby brother, and she's there when the daughter of Pharaoh opens up this basket, says, "This must be a Hebrew child." And Miriam comes in and says, "Would you like me to find a nurse for this child?" And goes and finds her mother and brings her to the palace. So Miriam's response to this suffering, this anxiety, is to continue believing, to wait, to watch, to follow, and to wait and see. If we take a look at Aaron in his suffering, when his sons are consumed by this strange fire that they bring to God, we notice that he is silent. He doesn't say anything. Moses, being next to him, comes in and says something which we might now think is inappropriate, but Aaron doesn't actually say anything in response to the death of his sons. He's completely silent. His response is internal. When we read the text, we don't know how he is feeling, what he's thinking, what's going on with him. His response in the face of suffering is to be silent, as many people are today who don't have anything to say, who either because they are angry or because they're deeply, deeply sad, or so bewildered and stunned, they don't respond in any way. And Moses, if we come to Moses, what is his response to suffering? His response is extremely emotive, passionate, and relational, right? As we read through the Torah, we see again and again and again Moses sort of tearing his hair out, saying, "God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you, yoking me to this people who are such complainers?" He is also praying to God on their behalf, advocating for them in these very emotional ways. And we see, too, in this moment after his sister's death, and after the complaining and the kvetching and the discontentedness of the children of Israel, what do we see in his response? God tells him how to give the children of Israel water, and he doesn't follow God's instructions. In this moment, in this one moment, he takes this rod. He's supposed to speak to the rock. He's not supposed to hit the rock, but he takes his rod, he takes his staff, and he says, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" And then he raises his hand. This is Numbers chapter 20, verse 10 to 11. He takes his staff, they assemble the congregation in front of the rock, and he says to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" And he raises his hand and he strikes the rock twice with his rod, and copious amounts of water come out, and the community and all of their animals drink from it. So Moses, in this moment, has an outburst, either because of his grief or his distress or his frustration. His response in this moment is extremely emotive. So we can think of an answer to this question: what obligation does suffering impose upon us? To make meaning, perhaps. That's one piece, to make meaning. For Miriam, it was perhaps continuing to believe. That's how she got meaning out of this experience. She follows, she finds use for herself. She enters into the story. What meaning does Aaron make? We don't know. His response is silence. He continues on in service of God, in service of the temple, in service of the Mishkan. But his response is mysterious. We don't know. And what is Moses' response? How does he make meaning? He is in relationship with God. He continues to be in relationship with God through the good and the bad, and continues to express himself and the way that he feels and the things that he thinks to God throughout his life throughout the ups and downs, the positive times and the experiences of suffering. The second piece, the second obligation, would be to not despair, right? Just as Miriam doesn't despair when she sees her brother put into the basket and cast into the river, she doesn't despair. She follows to see what will happen, and she continues to believe. So too, we can take this example of not despairing, right? It can be challenging to continue to believe, but not despairing, of waiting to see what will happen, is an example that we can all follow as we make our way into the world in this moment in time. So my bracha for all of us is that we should merit to not experience any kind of suffering, certainly not any kind of serious suffering. But if we do experience suffering, that we should be able to make some meaning out of it, find some meaning and purpose to the suffering that we've experienced, to bring perhaps more good into the world, and to enhance our connections to our community and to our family and to our learning, and to not despair. Moses does not despair after he learns that he will not be entering into the land. He seems to accept God's decree. Miriam does not despair. She waits and she follows. And we don't know about Aaron. He might have despaired, but that's not written into the text. But we could read it as saying that he didn't despair. He continued to be in relationship with the community, with God, and continued on in that way. So wishing us all a peaceful Shabbat, a Shabbat free from suffering, and a happy beginning of summer. Shabbat Shalom.